Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar today about opportunities for UK exporters in Australia, the third in a series of webinars about Commonwealth markets brought to you by the Institute of Export and International Trade. And Australia is indeed a country with which the UK has, of course, recently signed a brand new free trade agreement, albeit this hasn't been ratified yet. Nonetheless, it's a market with lots of opportunities for UK businesses. My name is William Barnes-Graham, the Executive Editor at the Institute, and I will be your host for this afternoon. Next slide, please. So here you'll see we have two fantastic speakers today. Suzanne Alacrim will be presenting first about practical considerations for exporters and some of the benefits of the Free Trade Agreement. Suzanne is a customs and trade specialist at the Institute with extensive experience in all areas of international trade, logistics, supply chain, and global customs compliance. After Suzanne, we'll be hearing from Julian Gingell, Principal at Ketdari Chambers, who joins us from Australia to give an overview of what you need to consider if setting up operations in the market. Julian is a corporate lawyer who has worked with clients both here and in Australia in the IT, e-commerce, multimedia, life sciences, and entertainment sectors. On the next slide, though, you'll see we're going to begin today's webinar with a quick poll to find out a little bit more about you, our audience. So which of these describes your trade with Australia at present? You may export to Australia, you may have operations subsidiaries established in Australia, you may be planning to export there, planning to set up operations, or you may have no plans as of yet to do business with Australia. For some businesses, more than one option may apply, so there's a multiple option facility available. Just while you are answering that poll, some housekeeping notes from me. Firstly, you can contact me with any comments or questions using the question panel on the control window to the right-hand side of your screen. We hope to get to a number of your questions today, though please note we cannot guarantee that we will get to every question in the allocated time. As such, I'll be prioritizing questions that have relevance to the wider audience, so I won't be going into company or sector-specific queries as such. And please note that if your questions are short and clear, I am more likely to be able to read them. Finally, you will receive access to today's slide pack, as well as a recording of a webinar in a follow-up email we will be sending over the next day or so. So I'll give you a couple more seconds to answer that poll. So 3, 2, 1, and I'll now share the results. So over a third of you already export to Australia, and about 2/5 of you are planning to export to Australia. A fifth of you already have operations or subsidiaries established in the market, and then a 10th of you, 11%, are planning to, and just under a fifth, 17% of you have no plans to do business with Australia. So a real spread actually of kind of companies in terms of where they are at with their trade, with the market, and we hope today's webinar is relevant to all of you. I'm going to hide the poll, and on the next slide to talk about some of the export opportunities, over to you, Suzanne.
Thanks very much, Will, and welcome everybody to our webinar today. If I could have the next slide, please. So today we're just going to cover a few aspects of trading with Australia. So it was really good to see on the poll that we have a lot of people who are already trading or considering trading with Australia. And since leaving the EU, the UK government has given priority to launch negotiations with key trading partners of the UK around the world. And Australia is one of them. So really good to see that companies do want to sort of take advantage of that. And as Will mentioned, we do have an agreement in principle that was signed with Australia on the 16th of June last year. So it does feel a very long way away. And people do sort of think once the deal is signed, then we can immediately use it. But that isn't always the case. When you trade with overseas countries, you're going to look for similarities, and this will make trade easier for you. So due to the history of Australia and the UK, both countries share a common language and culture, and this is also extended to business practices. Both countries also have good financial stability. Both legal systems are based on common law, and it makes it easier to understand contracts of sale. Therefore, trading with Australia can actually offer UK exporters many familiarities, as it would do with trading with UK businesses. Australia is on the other side of the world, and it's over 9,500 miles away in the southern hemisphere, so we can really only reach it by sea or air freight. Maritime vessels will take up to 8 weeks to transit to Australia, and there are major container ports around Australia. So on the west coast we have Fremantle Port in Perth, Brisbane on the east, and then Melbourne on the south coast. For urgent or perishable cargo or high value cargo such as gold, goods can be flown by air freight to major international airports with a transit time of around 3 to 4 days. The deal is a gateway to the UK joining the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, so you may often hear that in context with Australia as well. And Australia are actually strongly supporting UK membership. And only last week we saw Amanda Milling, the Minister for Asia and the Middle East, embarking on a tour of Western Australia. And she announced plans to re-establish the diplomatic post of Consul General in Perth. So again, we've got a lot of government support in place there. So by having a free trade agreement in place, both countries can continue their fruitful relationship, and by having economic measures in place, they can look to support their traders and boost their international trade. Next slide, please. So before traders can export their goods to Australia, there are a few key requirements that need to be fulfilled to ensure that the exports and then the respective imports can run smoothly. When traders export, they can zero rate invoices for VAT. They of course will need to evidence an export has taken place within 12 weeks of the invoice being raised by producing an export declaration and commercial and transport evidence of the international journey. We also need to consider the import regulations in Australia. The Australia Border Force regulates all goods imported, and importers will need to provide an import declaration and make payment of any relevant duties and taxes. Australia's biosecurity measures aim to prevent disease and pests entering the country through a strict inspection or treatment regime. So, for example, all wood products, including packaging and pallets, for example, must be heat treated and stamped with an IPPC mark to prove that the wood complies with the regulations. And the trader will also need to issue a certificate to confirm if a container contains wood or hay and if it has been treated. If not, then the cargo could be quarantined at import and further treatment may be carried out before the goods can be imported. There's also an alignment of regulatory requirements for product standards, with Australia adopting international standards. And with that in mind, a mutual recognition agreement has been drawn up in which both parties will accept conformity assessment results from each other, which means that UK goods can be tested in the UK against the Australian standards, and then they're ready for sale into the Australian market, and vice versa. Packaging must meet Australian consumer health and environmental legislation. There are specific labelling requirements for chemical products, cosmetics, electronic goods and food products, and all labelling must use the metric system. Gov.uk gives a list of trade barriers which could slow down, stop or raise costs for UK companies doing businesses, such as overcomplicated customs procedures or taxes and tariffs that put UK traders at a disadvantage. There are currently only 2 trade barriers identified with Australia, and this goes to show how trader-friendly Australia is when you compare it to other countries such as Canada, where there are 19 trade barriers, or the USA, where there are actually 24 trade barriers. Next slide, please. So the trade deal will help businesses to trade goods between the UK and Australia quickly and easily. Reducing administrative burdens will boost trade between countries and accelerate business growth through exporting. The free trade agreement is not yet in force, as both parties are required to complete their respective domestic procedures for the agreement to come into effect. Once approved by both parliaments, businesses will be able to trade under its terms. So what are the main benefits for UK businesses? We're going to have tariff-free exports. All industries will see an elimination of tariffs on all products. Most products are currently around the 5% tariff mark. However, in the food industry, cheese has a tariff around 20%, for example. Therefore, it's going to be extremely beneficial to zero rate tariffs under the agreement. Flexible and simple rules of origin. The UK exporters won't need to evidence that their ingredients or raw materials wholly originate in the UK to qualify for 0% tariffs. Manufacturers have the freedom to source materials internationally, obtaining the best price and quality, and still qualify for zero-rated tariffs on the finished products. And simple customs. Both parties have agreed to make it simpler for traders to import and export by minimising red tape and paperwork, reducing data requirements, and a commitment to implementing a single trade window. Rapid clearance will be in place with guaranteed clearance within 48 hours. And for perishable goods and fast parcel operators such as companies like FedEx or DHL, their goods will be able to clear within 6 hours. And there will be no need for a trader to use a customs broker. However, it will require traders to create their own export and import declarations on CDS if they do choose not to use a broker. They're also going to maintain high standards. There's going to be one set of checks for compliance to standards carried out by the exporting country. The UK certificates will be recognised by Australian authorities. The deal also enshrines both countries' high environmental standards and further supports global decarbonisation. It will see greater regulatory cooperation and shared commitments to support a more sustainable economy. The trade deal will be the first one created with a dedicated chapter to innovation, where both countries commit to cooperate on commercial application of new technologies such as artificial intelligence and carbon capture. There will be simpler rules for investment as well. Fewer UK investments will need to go through Australia's Foreign Investment Review Board, therefore quadrupling the UK's previous threshold. And there will be cheaper imports for components. Removing tariffs in the UK on Australian goods will make it cheaper for UK manufacturers to import components and assemble a final product in the UK. For example, the import tariff on Australian merino wool is going to be cut from 8% to 0%. And we have sustainable and clean growth. By including specific priorities to cooperate on low emissions technology, renewable energy, and energy efficient technologies, the deal promotes closer collaboration and innovation on next generation green technology for sustainable and clean growth. Next slide, please. The rules of origin stipulate how much of a product must originate in the UK to qualify for the zero-rated tariff as outlined in the deal when exported to Australia. Simple rules of origin have been agreed, which will allow British producers to continue to source ingredients and materials from other countries and then ship the final product to Australia, still taking advantage of the zero-rated tariffs. UK businesses will be able to make use of inward processing relief for imported materials without losing access to preferential tariffs when exporting finished goods to Australia. This can allow for the duty-free import of materials used in the production of an export. The new rules of origin have been designed to support the UK and Australia's existing and future supply chains. In the food sector, the requirement for ingredients to wholly originate in the UK or Australia has been removed, allowing businesses to be more competitive and flexible in sourcing the best ingredients for their products. British clothing producers will find it easier and cheaper to trade their products with Australia. UK businesses, even those who manufacture from imported materials and fabrics, will qualify for zero tariffs for their exports to Australia. And British car manufacturers will now have more freedom to source car parts and materials internationally and potentially save millions of pounds worth of duties. British cars will qualify for tariff-free trade as long as 25% of the value of the car is produced in the UK. Next slide, please. As the future of trade is set around the digital industry and the safe and quick transfer of data, the trade deal will create opportunities for the UK's cutting-edge digital and tech sectors by facilitating free flow of data with high standards on data protection. Businesses won't face unjustified barriers to data flows, such as the requirement to store their data in costly servers in Australia. The trade deal will outline tackling cybersecurity threats to work more closely with each other on shared cybersecurity challenges, ensuring businesses don't have to share source code or encryption keys to enter the Australian market. Mobility provisions achieved through the trade deal will give UK companies a competitive edge by ensuring highly skilled staff can work to deliver contracts in Australia. And the UK and Australia will deepen their cooperation on AI and other disruptive digital technologies, which they will work together to drive commercialization and facilitate trade in these products. Next slide, please. So there's going to be a chapter within the trade agreement that will be dedicated to small and medium-sized enterprises, the SMEs. This is to ensure that both parties provide information specifically designed to help smaller businesses trade. It will help to address the disproportionate barriers to trade that SMEs can face when entering another market. Both the UK and Australia will maintain dedicated websites for their businesses looking to trade. This will allow SMEs to access information on how to do business in their respective territories. They will also create online databases of tariffs and other trade-related information that can be easily searched. The UK and Australia have agreed to a detailed cooperation framework to learn from each other, and they will focus on exchange of best practice as well to support the SMEs. They will also cover training programs to enable smaller companies to take advantage of commercial opportunities within the deal, which will help UK companies in receiving more direct help in identifying commercial partners in Australia. Many of the UK's small businesses rely on online platforms to sell their products to customers around the world. The trade deal supports e-commerce by guaranteeing the legal validity of electronic contracts and electronic transactions. Both parties will work towards ensuring that tools used to verify people's ID and authenticate online transactions will work in both countries. Next slide, please. Trade deal is going to offer support to UK industry, and the list here outlines the key industries that the government have identified to directly benefit from the trade deal. The food and drinks industry. It will protect UK farmers with a tariff rate quota on sensitive agricultural products such as beef and sheep meat. And there is a dedicated chapter on animal welfare. The UK has a world-renowned industrial heritage in manufacturing, and many companies with globally recognised capabilities in automation, energy and technology. The automotive industry. Since Australia ended its car production, all new cars sold in Australia are imported. And this gives the UK a competitive advantage, especially in premium and luxury cars, where the UK is a global leader. Professional and business services. This covers legal services, accountancy and engineering, and the deal will create opportunities to increase trade in this area, which is currently worth 1.2 billion. Financial services, supporting the UK's leadership in fintech and promoting innovation in financial services. UK companies have an excellent track record in winning contracts for major Australian infrastructure projects and will benefit from more legally guaranteed access to government procurement on rail, maritime and airport infrastructure. It will benefit transport industries by including specific priorities to collaborate on the commercialisation of low emissions technologies. The UK telecommunications sector is critical to supporting the UK's thriving digital economy. And this deal will lock in access to the Australian market for suppliers, support investment and innovation in the telecom sector and maximise the connectivity. We have consumer goods and fashion and life sciences as well, and they're all going to benefit from enhanced collaboration on emerging technologies. There are a lot of opportunities across a wide range of sectors for exporters, as you can see. And the trade deal will benefit anyone who wants to take advantage of it in boosting their overseas trade with Australia. And we eagerly await the ratified agreement so that traders can fully take advantage of these benefits. Thank you. I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, Suzanne. A really detailed overview there of the kind of export procedures, particularly under what we hopefully will be a soon to be ratified trade deal. I'm going to launch the second poll, and this is just asking you to say, what do you think will be the main benefit of the trade deal? So the options there including reduced tariffs, easier travel, or that could be visa rights, mutual recognition of qualifications, reduced bureaucracy, and other. And if you do say other, please feel free to say what that what you mean in the chat. Suzanne, we've had a few people asking about the ratification process. So we had Gary Lenker ask this in advance, and then Christoph has asked it just now. When do you think, or when do we what's the timeline for the trade deals ratification, and when will it come into force?
So we're actually still quite a long way off being able to take advantage of the trade deal. As I mentioned earlier, people do sort of think once it's signed, we'll be able to start working with it straight away. But earlier this year, the government issued a new UK trade bill to help facilitate the implementation of new trade deals. And we don't currently have a trade policy in place in how to handle the maintaining of the deals as well. So that's something else that needs to be looked at. The House of Lords International Agreements Committee scrutinised the agreement in June and then issued its report of findings to the Parliament. So there needs to be further scrutiny by Parliament under the Constitutional Reform and the Governments Act, and the trade bill has yet to be passed by Parliament as well. We also need necessary secondary legislation, which needs to be passed by Parliament to make the changes required to the procurement regime to meet the terms of the agreement. And then Australia as well, they also need to be carrying out their own scrutiny of the deal as well. So only once these steps have been completed can these agreements be ratified and brought into force. So I think we're probably looking at sometime next year, depending on what the political and economic situations are like. But at least we know that both sides are actually moving forward in ratifying at the moment.
Thank you, Suzanne. I'm just going to share the results to that poll, as ever, really interesting, but maybe unsurprising given the number of exporters and companies planning to export on the line. So 61% of you saying reduced tariffs, 23% of you saying reduced bureaucracy, only 3% saying for easier travel, 5% mutual recognition of qualifications, and there is other as well at 8%. Suzanne, I mean, we had a question from Gary, which was about the reduced tariffs. He says, will the import duties in Australia still be in place once the agreement is ratified? So what's the process when it's ratified? Do the tariffs just go straight like that, or is there a process which is launched by that trade agreement coming into process?
Yeah, so pretty much once we know that that trade deal is in place and the zero tariff can be applied, then that should be put in place with the customs system. So it's usually done under the process. So in the UK, when we carry out an import, we would use a specific code, which would then allow preference. So we see that already with the UK. But the same sort of thing would apply. So once we know that's in place, that would be used actually on the customs declarations, and then the system wouldn't actually apply the duty rate. So yes, it should come in straight away. And to remember as well that although it is a free trade deal where the tariffs are zero rated, traders will only be able to benefit this as long as they do meet the rules of origin, and the commodity codes that they're importing are not actually subject to any quotas that are within the tariff. So once it's published, get to have a look at that deal, check your commodity codes and just see exactly what the specific requirements are for rules of origin, and then you will understand whether you can benefit from that zero rate straight away.
And my understanding is I know there was some debate about agricultural goods. So I think, am I right in saying some tariffs are being phased, or the tariff reduction is being phased for certain goods? Is that the UK end though for certain agricultural goods like beef and lamb?
Yes, so that's been approved for goods coming into the UK. It is going to be over a phased period of time, which is where we'll see. So what we're going to see is a quota in place. So any products that go above that quota, then an extra tariff is going to be applied. So they would no longer be zero rated. And to note as well that the government are expecting that those sort of products that come from Australia are going to be products that are going to be replacing products that would have come from Europe. So Australia's biggest meat markets are actually in Asia. It's not as if the UK is expecting to be totally flooded by products from Australia. It should replace sort of any existing there. And we have about 82% of meat supplied in the UK is actually from UK farmers. So there is a very little amount that is being imported. But the quotas that have been put in place, they're there to benefit traders for the first 10 years, and then they're going to manage those quotas through the trade policy that they'll put in place. They'll actually manage what comes in and have a look at that. And then between years 11 to 15, there are further measures that the governments are able to put in place to safeguard their local industries. And they don't actually sort of see agriculture in the UK, just as commodities. They do see them as communities, and it's a way of life that they're supporting here. It's not just the trading of products. So the UK government have negotiated those quotas with a view to actually safeguarding, the way of life of our agricultural providers.
Thank you, Suzanne. That's really interesting. It got a lot of coverage when the agreement was signed. So thank you for sharing
Mhm.
that. We look forward to hearing a bit more from you later on as well during the Q&A. But for now, on the next slide, it's my delight to welcome on Julian Gingell down from Australia. He's going to talk a bit more about the opportunity for UK firms and considerations for businesses who may be setting up shop down under as well. Julian, though, over to you. Great to have you on board for today's webinar.
Thanks very much, Will, and welcome everybody. Great attendance list. Thank you for everybody showing that interest. Look, the slides that I've got here are quite lengthy. I assure you I am not going to deal with every single bullet point. I'm going to use certain bullet points purely as an example, almost as a metaphor for a broader statement that can be made. And I'll start off by making that statement, and really everything drills down from that. Suzanne and Will have already highlighted the fact that Australia and the UK share a common legal system, a common culture, a common love of specific sports. We like to do the same things at a social level. We go about business in essentially the same way. And if one thinks about it, that shouldn't really be an extraordinary statement. The history of Australia, excusing, of course, the history associated with the indigenous people who came before Captain Cook, but Captain Cook did plant that flag in 1777, and from that time onwards, the laws of England applied in Australia, and therefore the same systems of government were adopted, the same ways of carrying on business were adopted, the same legal systems, rule of law was all inherited from the UK during the course of the 19th and the 20th century. So it shouldn't really be remarkable when one makes the statement that doing business in Australia, in terms of either setting up, carrying on business, appointing distributors, wherever you look, apart from different accents, apart from the fact that we use dollars, not pounds, I often say that your learning curve when you're doing your homework, your due diligence on the Australian market, the biggest part of that learning curve is learning the new acronyms. And again, just to give not a silly example, an easy example, you have VAT, value added tax. We have exactly the same thing, except we call it the GST, goods and services tax. And the only difference there is it's 10%. The GST was essentially copied from VAT in 2000. So while that might seem a very simple example, it's an example which I call a metaphor for the entire process of setting yourself up here or carrying on business in or with Australia. The learning curve just isn't that significant. I will make a couple of comments on the FTA. Next slide, please. Sorry, I have to get used to this next slide business. I'm usually in control of my slides. So the best thing about the UK-Australia trade agreement, in one point, Suzanne has covered it very thoroughly, so I won't try to dive in there or repeat what she said. But the one thing that I see about the free trade agreement is something that is utterly unique, first time ever in a free trade agreement between two countries, was that it set up a management committee from day one that will monitor and review and track the benefits. It will monitor, review and track any areas for advantage or to improve, such that in 5 years' time, when the two governments look at it again, we're not scrambling around trying to find version 2. From day one, this FTA will be monitored, and will be a joint committee making sure that in 5 years' time, when it comes to be renewed, we are in a position to enhance it. And I think that the key message out of that is that you can, even though the free trade agreement in 2023, when it comes into force, perhaps it hasn't got everything in there that everybody wants, but one can look at it as a reliable document, not just for 2023, but a document which heralds an increasing working relationship between the two countries. And as that final bullet point there notes, it is also a stepping stone to the CPTPP, which must be one of the worst acronyms known to mankind. But even looking wider than the FTA, looking wider than the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the relationship between the two countries is so deep. And I look to things like both countries being historical members of the WTO, World Trade Organization, and as part of being members of the World Trade Organization, signatories to the GATT agreement, GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, signatories to the UN use of Incoterms. The two countries are members of what's called the Five Eyes, UK, America, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, in the sharing of sensitive intelligence. The AUKUS alliance that was entered into earlier this year. The relationship between the two countries is so deep and, most importantly, only going to get better. And I think that that is a key thing for businesses when going about your planning, doing your costing, doing your business modeling, your business plans, taking a view on risk, which is obviously appropriate. The risk factor is, in relative terms, obviously nothing is risk-free, we all know that. But I do suggest that the risk factor when considering the Australian market, either to build up your presence or to start a presence in Australia, is one of the best opportunities at the moment. Next slide, please. So this is just a checklist for companies, I guess, for companies who are starting to think about trading in or with Australia. Companies that are already here, less relevant because by definition you're already here. But as a checklist of things to think about, first thing, trading structures. And the trading structures, by which I mean, do you set up a company? Do you set up a partnership? Do you have a joint venture with an Australian company, which would come under the partnering or use of distributors, marketing and distribution agents? What is your business model? What is your trading structure? And I don't have an answer to that, in the sense that that will be specific to your company. It'll relate to the products and or services that you're wanting to sell into the Australian market, either by setting up your own Australian company here or working through Australian distributors. The next thing to look at would be the terms of business that you have for your products and services in the UK. One would certainly need to tweak those. It's not a case of rewriting them. I do a great deal where I Australianize terms of business, standard contracts that are written under English law or the appropriate law of the overseas company. And 9 times out of 10, it is a very simple exercise of tweaking them for Australian law. Intellectual property, obviously, even if you're just putting product on a boat at Southampton and selling your product into the Australian market, one needs to be careful that trademarks, patents, designs, you're not going to run into any intellectual property infringement issues because intellectual property is a country by country thing. People sometimes talk about their international intellectual property rights. There are no such thing as international intellectual property rights. It could be international in the sense that you could register your intellectual property in lots of different countries, thereby creating, in effect, an international presence. But trademarks registered in Australia or trademarks used in Australia need to be registered with the Australian Trademark Office. Same with patents, same with designs, same with domain names. Employees and visas. Obviously, depending on your business model, if you are going to set up in Australia, then that almost certainly would involve having employees, and that would almost certainly involve visas if you're sending people over from the UK or from elsewhere. And that obviously comes with a degree of needing to go through appropriate immigration specialists. Another item on your checklist might be leasing premises, which would be exactly the same sort of issues as you would encounter if you're leasing premises, whether it be warehouse type premises, office space, exactly the same sort of issues that you would be familiar with in the UK. Tax, again, tax very similar, either at the personal level or at the corporate level. One has tax thresholds, one has bands where you pay at a certain rate, and then usually the percentage tax increases as you go above the thresholds. Those thresholds change from government to government from time to time, but you'll be familiar with those tax issues, if I can call them that. Obviously, it is all built around the same idea of you pay tax on profits. You have allowable deductions at the corporate level, and also at the personal level, you pay tax on your salary or on your income, but again with deductions, allowable deductions. Finally, bank accounts. Now, bank accounts are becoming a real headache, or have become a real headache in terms of the red tape to set up bank accounts in Australia. And quite frankly, it's not just in Australia, it is all countries are now regulating banks and financial institutions in a very heavy-handed manner. And I'm not necessarily being critical, I'm just being realistic. Opening a bank account here will take you much, much longer than, say, setting up the company. I can set up a company for you in Australia in about 2 or 3 hours. I can open up a bank account for you at best in 2 to 3 months. And that's simply because I'm assuming that in saying that if you are going to set up an Australian subsidiary company, that you would therefore have offshore directors and offshore shareholders, where the whole proof of identity thing, know your KYC, know your customer, and anti-money laundering requirements are such that the red tape is significant. And that's the world we live in, I'm afraid. Next slide, please. So the legal landscape, I'm not going to go into this in any great detail, simply because I'm going to repeat myself in saying, pick out any of those bullet points you like, and I will simply say, it's the same here as it is in the UK, to all intents and purposes. It might be written in slightly different words, but the learning curve is just not significant. I'll pick out one of those bullet points just to give an example: employment law. So whether or not you're going to employ people, I'm using this again as a sort of a metaphor example, where I'm going to use employment law as an example of something where, as between Australia and the UK, it is essentially the same, in the sense that employees are employed to do a job and they're paid a salary. The employer has an obligation to provide a reasonably safe place of work, but the employee is employed to do a job at the direction of the employer, subject obviously to certain limitations. But the employer-employee relationship is essentially the same. If you drill down into the minutiae, there are a couple of little changes. There are a couple of little roadblocks or speed bumps that you might not be familiar with. For example, in Australia, in addition to annual leave, employees who have worked a long time with a particular employer are entitled to what's called long service leave. So after 10 years, employees get a nice little 6-week sabbatical on top of their employment, on top of their annual leave. Fair enough, most employees would say, but something that an employer needs to take into account. Obviously, I think in 2022, the chances are that, unfortunately, perhaps, I won't be judgmental, but the workforce is far more movable. People don't often stay with employers for 10 years, but some do, obviously. Some people stay with their employer for 20, 30, 40 years. And for those people in Australia who've done that, they've maybe had 3 or even 4 long service leaves. I won't say any more about that. It's just an example of where UK and Australian law and relationships are 99% the same, but every now and then, yes, you do have a little wrinkle that you might not be familiar with. Next slide, please. Corporate structures we've really done, really running the risk of repeating myself, but one can incorporate companies here, and when you set up a company, it basically works in exactly the same way as if you set up a company down at Companies House in Cardiff. That is, you would appoint directors and you would have shareholders. The directors run the company on a day-to-day basis and are responsible for running the company in the best interest of shareholders. Directors have a range of duties and potential liabilities, all the same as in the UK, in the sense that the directors have exactly the same relationship with the company and the shareholders. And I'm talking much more here about private companies, listed companies, companies listed on the Australian Stock Exchange, in the same way as companies listed on the London Stock Exchange have even higher obligations under the listing rules. But to all intents and purposes, the way in which one carries on business under corporate structures in Australia, you've got the same options, the same pros and cons as you do in the UK. There's no right answer. You simply look at the advantages and the disadvantages, and you make your choice. Next slide, please. Right, this is just my little interlude slide, but I think useful, because for people coming to the Australian market for the first time, everybody knows it's a big place. Of course, that stands to reason. That's nothing new. But I thought it's a nice little slide just to show how big a place it is. But the good news about all of that is if you look down the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see Sydney and Melbourne. So Sydney sort of in the southeast, and Melbourne right down the very bottom above Tasmania and Hobart. It's an unfortunate slide because unfortunately the author forgot to put in Canberra, which is our capital of the country, capital city, and it's sort of halfway between Sydney and Melbourne. So it's roundabout where some Greek islands are. Anyway, the good thing is, I'll come to, is that 3/4 of the relevant population is either just outside or around Sydney and in between Sydney and Melbourne and around Melbourne. So a lot of companies will prioritize that bottom right-hand corner because that is 3/4 of the 25 million of us, 26 million of us. The last time I looked, probably pre-pandemic, the Sydney to Melbourne Qantas flight sector was the 3rd most flown sector on the planet after London, Paris, and Boston, New York. So it's a heavily traveled sector. It's well supplied by, certainly by planes, certainly, and trains, and a decent enough. We don't have proper motorway systems, but good logistics. Next slide, please.
Julian, just a heads up in terms of time, and the fact that we will be sharing these slides with everyone afterwards. So if a couple more minutes would be absolutely fine. But yeah, if we could get to the questions in a minute, that'd be great.
The point, I am repeating myself. So if you were going to appoint a distributor, a reseller under a marketing and distribution agreement here, your checklist of things to talk about with your lawyer here would be exactly the same. And so the checklist that you look up there, and okay, just look at scope. What's the scope of a distribution and reseller agreement? Is it exclusive or non-exclusive? You start with those standard questions, and a distribution and reseller or marketing and distribution agreement, whatever you want to call it, will look very, very similar to your marketing and distribution agreement in the UK. And the rest of these slides now are just bullet points where I would essentially be making that same point. So I'm very happy to skip to the bottom line in the interest of time and in the interest of boring people to death by simply saying the same thing over and over again. So,
no, thank you, Julian. That was a really, really interesting kind of an overview, I guess. And there's a lot of detail on these slides, so we will be sharing them with everyone. But I think the main points you've made are really important. There's sort of similarities which are there, but the slight differences that people should just be on their toes about. and also the size of the Australia as a place. And Canberra, I guess, is probably quite an important place, but if these things happen, don't they? Sydney and
Bit
Melbourne.
embarrassing to leave off Canberra
Yes,
off the
these
back
things
like
happen.
that.
But if we move on a few slides, actually what I'll do is I'll move to the poll. I'll just launch the poll and I guess feel chance to catch up on slides. But yeah, just asking you here what you think the biggest challenge of the Australia market is going to be. We have tariffs, logistics and distance, quarantine regulations, and other as the 5 options you can pick from there. And just while that poll's running, Julian, we've had loads of questions, so I'll get straight to it. We had a question from Christopher, and he said he's trying to establish. He's asking, can you establish an e-commerce store in Australia if you're a foreign company not currently registered in the country? And what would the key considerations be in the Australian market if using e-commerce?
Yes, you can remain entirely offshore in that sense. One of my longest standing clients is a company down in just outside Brighton. They have carried on an e-commerce site which they point towards Australia for the sake of people in Australia thinking that they're actually dealing with an Australian company. I don't mean that to suggest that people should be deceptive, but they get a .com.au or a .net.au, or even now, very recently, you can get just a .au. So, but that's more a marketing statement than a legal statement. If you want to sell products or services for that matter, I've got a number of clients who provide cloud-based services to Australia over essentially a website in the UK, and people purchase over the internet, whether it's products or services. Australia actually has always had one of the highest uptakes of technology. And I remember reading statistics years ago about the uptake per head of things like mobile phones going back to the 1990s. And Australia was always in the top 1 or 2 of the uptake of new technology. And again, in part, that's probably not a surprising statement, because Australia can do nothing about the tyranny of distance. We can't make Australia any closer to the rest of the world. But what we can do with the benefit of technology is reduce the impact, and we can overcome some of the problems of tyranny of distance, either the distance just within Australia from Sydney to Perth, or from Sydney to the rest of the world. So very high uptake of technology. And yes, certainly you can set up a website, an offshore website.
That's really interesting, actually. I didn't know about the Australia being such a fast adopter of technologies, but your explanation makes complete sense. And it leads on to the response to the poll. So 47% of delegates saying logistics and distance is the main challenge for trade with Australia, followed by just under a quarter saying market knowledge. I mean, one of the questions we've been getting, and it's one I ask, is Australia's obviously a long way away. And yet the UK is pursuing this kind of green trade agenda. I mean, I wonder, Suzanne, if you want to come in on this. I mean, how can exporters make the most of opportunities in Australia without really kind of adding to their carbon footprint?
Yeah, so I mean, one thing that we see in this free trade agreement is that, again, there is a chapter that's dedicated to the environment. Both parties have confirmed that they are committed to address climate change under the UN's Framework Convention on the Climate Change, and also the Paris Agreement, so that's good to see. They are also working towards the circular economy, to use resources more effectively and avoid waste. And of course, this is also, encouraged throughout industry and with their traders. They're also going to be taking measures within the agreement to protect marine environment from ship pollution and marine litter. But one thing that traders can actually do, because it is so far away, rather than sending lots of little small shipments out, potentially you may have an order on a monthly basis and you're only going to port a couple of pallets inside a container. Instead of doing that on a monthly basis, you could actually fill a container, consolidate your own container and send it out, maybe have a distributor over in Australia to help you distribute it. then reduces the carbon footprint, because you're only going to be using one ship to get your goods over to Australia rather than 3 or 4. So traders can make little changes, and we are seeing as well, you know, marine shipments as well as air, they are increasing, you know, that their footprint. They're putting taxes and measures in place to make sure that things are becoming more green. They're using greener fuels. We're also starting to see, you know, autonomous ships that are using, you know, electric energy, solar and the like. So, you know, there are lots of things that are happening that would help traders to reduce their footprint in the future.
I think there's also just the option of appointing a manufacturer in Australia, where you license. Obviously, it depends on the capacity and know-how and everything, but I certainly do. When I say a lot of agreements, I do a couple a year, appointing not just somebody as a distributor, but where you get the distributor to also arrange local manufacturing. And certainly it's been the case for a long time that a lot of the manufacturing is then outsourced to China. Whether that continues is another matter, or even to the Philippines, or, you know, somewhere closer to Australia. Because certainly a lot of my clients, I don't regard Australia, or one good thing about Australia is the fact that they see it as not just Australia, but then a base for Asia Pacific, Asia generally, to then look to other countries as markets, but to use Sydney or Melbourne as a sort of a head office for Asia Pac. And that might also involve appointing local manufacturers as a different business model.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, we won't go into it today, but I wondered to what extent 3D printing and all those sort of technologies will even facilitate that further as well. But conscious of time, so we're going to extend the webinar, I think, to the full hour. So we'll do a couple more questions. We had this one from another Gary, who is asking about if the process for importing into Australia differs from state to state. And I guess a question which I think is linked to it is, as you showed, Julian, the Australian market is huge. Does it make more sense for UK traders to think about it in terms of exporting to Melbourne or exporting to Brisbane? It doesn't make sense to think about it on a regional basis.
Yeah, look, that's definitely a yes and no. I'll explain the yes. Yes, you could think of the states as being different markets for one or more reasons. One reason might be because the states are still autonomous at a political level, in the sense that there is a parliament in Sydney, there is a governing New South Wales, there is a parliament in Melbourne governing Victoria, etc., etc. Every state has its own parliament, and the 2 territories have parliaments. So to a certain extent, they're autonomous. And that means that if you are looking to the public sector as a customer who may be involved with big public sector procurement projects, or just viewing the public sector as a customer, then Australia is 7 or 8 different potential customers at the public sector level, plus the head offices that were in Canberra. The federal government in Canberra is another public sector customer for you. So in that respect, you might treat the states as individual potential customers. On another level, you might look to, say, for example, Perth. Perth is the head office for our mining and resources sector. If your products or services are specifically relevant to that particular sector, you would probably regard Western Australia as quite distinct. You would probably go straight to Perth to set up, whereas virtually anywhere else or any other sector, Australia is pretty homogenous in terms of the customers that you'd be looking to target. You might find some sort of specialty. The banking sector is particularly strong in Melbourne, but where there are a lot of head offices, so you might prioritise Melbourne and Victoria if the banking and finance sector is particularly important. But as a general statement, the state borders are non-existent. The trade between the states of Australia, there are no trade barriers at the borders. A lot of people would take the view that the states of Australia do nothing more in terms of relevance than play cricket and rugby against each other. And that's pretty close to my view on that subject.
Well, it's very important, the sports aspect of this as well, but probably less in terms of a trade perspective. But we'll do 2 more questions. We've had a few people ask about origin. So if I put this to you, Susan, here's a good example. Mike has asked what rules of origin might apply to, say, his firm makes bikes and cycling accessories. So he's asking what rules might apply if parts are sourced from outside the UK but exported to Australia as a complete item.
Again, that's going to be down to the actual trade agreement and what we actually see in there. But it would be specified so that you would understand what applies to those components. And as I say, there are some simplifications, so people may be very familiar with the way that the European arrangement works, and you're looking at percentages and values of components, where they come from, whether they're already accumulated into other trade deals. So that has definitely been simplified, but the actual individual requirements are not going to be known until the actual trade deal is published, I'm afraid.
That makes complete sense. I'll do one more question, and yeah, conscious that we've flicked through what is a massive market in quite a short amount of time. So just wanted to point out that we have included a handout of FAQs which Julian's put together. You should be able to download that. There's a drop down in the GoToWebinar panel saying handouts. You should be able to download that from there, and we'll try to include that in the follow-up messaging as well. And there's a few links which we'll be sharing there as well. So thank you as well to Julian for providing those. And the last question, it's come from, I think it was Christoph. Forgive me if it was someone else. I've got a lot of questions reading through here. It's around, so from Mark, it was around what support is available for traders looking to make the most of opportunities in Australia, particularly following the trade deal. If I can begin with Suzanne from a UK side, and then it'd be great to hear from Julian in terms of support in the market as well. But Susan, what support are we hearing about from, say, DIT for helping firms make the most of the trade deal?
So there are definitely schemes available. The DIT have actually recently launched an internationalisation fund for businesses in England, so not the whole of the UK, but purely in England for the moment. And this is to help support us with businesses in areas such as market research, intellectual property, trade fairs, market visits, and consultancy. So if you do have a trade advisor at the DIT, it's worth contacting them, tell them that you're interested in dealing with Australia, and then they'll be able to direct you to the help that's out there that the government is putting in place. And certainly we saw as well that there is the dedicated chapter for small businesses, and there is going to be dedicated websites and help for smaller businesses as well. So the trade deal isn't all about large corporations taking benefit of this. It is really aimed at all areas of business. So DIT is probably the best place to start, and then tell them what you want to do, and then they'll be able to point you in the right direction as to what funding is available and what help they can offer you.
And support in Australia, Julian, what's available to UK firms in particular?
Yeah, look, I will answer that, but I agree with Suzanne. DIT is a really good organisation. I've worked with them very closely since 2004, 2005, when they were called UKTI. It's very good because in the UK, as you probably know, you have regional ITAs, trade advisors, and their value there is that they will then direct UK-based companies to the appropriate advisor at this end, who is not regional. The advisor at the Australian end will be industry specific. So if you are in food and drink in the West Country, then you'll go to your Bristol DIT person, and Bristol DIT will send you probably to either Sydney or Melbourne, where there's a specialist trade advisor in the food and drink sector, or in the IT sector, or whatever. It becomes sector specific. Australia has an equivalent called Austrade. I think it's fair to say, if somebody from Austrade is listening, I really apologise for what I'm about to say, but I think for UK-based companies coming to Australia, DIT would be my priority, because that's what DIT is all about. Whereas Austrade is more about helping Australian companies export to the UK. Both DIT and Austrade will definitely tell you, and it is the case, that they have mutual, they work with companies going in either direction. But I would simply say, as a relative statement, prioritise DIT, but by all means get onto Austrade as well. Austrade are in the Australian High Commission in the Strand. I have a number of good contacts there. In fact, I did a seminar with them in May in London when I was there, and absolutely no harm in going to both.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, I think we're approaching the time, I think. So if we can move back a couple of slides, I think we'll finish just with the slide with Julian's contact details, just in case anyone wants to contact him with any further inquiries. But yeah, I'm going to have to wrap up now. So it's going to be a good evening to Julian and a good morning to Suzanne. The sun has just started shining as well. So we're going to finish. We hope you found that useful. As noted earlier, we are running this webinar as part of a series on Commonwealth markets, which we're doing throughout the year. We did a session on the Commonwealth in general and the Caribbean market. We did both of those in June, I think it was. The recordings of both of those are on our YouTube channel, where you'll be able to find the recording of this webinar by the end of today as well. This will be sent to all registrants along with a copy of the slides and the handout over the next day or so. Our next webinar is on Monday next week, when we'll be hearing about some of the changes to UK trade that will be introduced under the target operating model, which is due to be published this autumn. We've also got a webinar on the Chief to CDS migration next Tuesday. So a couple of really important webinars next week. You can find registration links to both of these on our website, export.org.uk. As you leave today's webinar, please do let us know what you thought of it and any suggestions of topics for future webinars by completing the exit survey. But for now, thank you for joining us, whether it's in the UK or Australia, and I hope you have a great rest of the day, however much of it is remaining. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thanks, Will.